Human rights advocacy. The importance of the topic literally leaps from the headlines as we watch the serious problems across the globe in places like the Ukraine and Syria right now. This type of event is an outstanding example of interdisciplinary cooperation between the various different schools on campus and with outside institutions as well. The law school is proud and honored to be associated with this effort. It's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Dean Chatterjee, a global expert on these issues, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Christian. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor David Rodin here and welcome him to our campus and to the S.J. Quinney College of Law for his keynote on the topic of between pacifism and just war theory. So, David Rodin is a leading authority on the ethics of war and conflict. He is Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University, where he co-directs the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, and serves as Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York City. His publications include Preemption, published by Oxford, Just and Unjust Warriors, again published by Oxford, and then War and Self-Defense, published by Oxford, which was awarded the American Philosophical Association's Sharp Prize. He is also the author of many, many articles in leading philosophy and law journals. Now, like our colleague here in the law school, Benedict Kingsbury, David Rodin is also a Rhodes Scholar from New Zealand. He has a BPhil and DPhil in philosophy from Oxford University. He was previously Senior Research Fellow at the Australian National University. David was the inaugural Director of Research at the Oxford Euro Centre for Practical Ethics and a founding member of the Oxford Leverhulme Programme on the Changing Character of War. Dr. Rodin is a regular lecturer in the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College, where he provides ethics training for senior officers up to the rank of 2-star generals. He has also worked in the private sector as a senior associate with the Boston Consulting Group. So we welcome David Rodin here, and the title of his keynote is Between Pacifism and Just War Theory. David?
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for those very kind words of introduction and welcome. Pardon me. So as Dean mentioned, I come from New Zealand, and which, as many of you know, is a very, very beautiful natural environment. But I have to say that I was really blown away by the location that you have here in Utah, in the valley next to the mountains. I just think it's absolutely stunning. I'm really regretting that I don't have longer to spend here to do some hiking and maybe some snowboarding. But I'm very grateful for the time that we have here together. I'm grateful to the law school for hosting us today, to the Tanner Center, to Dean, and to the other organizers of this conference for the opportunity to discuss this. So for nearly 2,000 years now, just war theory has provided the primary context for addressing the ethics of war within the Western tradition. Let me just pause there for a moment just to ask how many people within this room are familiar with just war theory, what it is. Okay, very good. Most of you. So the 30-second, for those of you who don't, the 30-second description of what it is. Just war theory is really a body of ethical thought about war that begins with the early Christian thinkers and really provided the context for the development of the modern laws of war that we know today. And it's really an attempt to provide a kind of a middle way between pacifism, the rejection of all warfare entirely, and a kind of realism that says that there are no rules at all within the domain of war. So it's to say that war is permissible, but only under certain kinds of particular constraints. And those have to do with the so-called jus ad bellum, the rules for when you can start a war, and the jus in bello, literally the justice within war, the rules of what you can do within warfare. So my topic today is really what we should make of just war theory. As I said, for almost 2,000 years now, just war theory has provided really the dominant context for thinking about the ethics of war within the Western tradition. But I want to maintain that just war theory is no longer serving us well, intellectually, morally, strategically, or politically. It's indeed remarkable that this intellectual edifice, which is a product of the early medieval intellectual worldview, has survived more or less intact into the 20th century. There are very, very few elements of that worldview that still have currency today, and that's one of them. I believe that the time has come to develop an approach to the ethics and international affairs which is consistent with a modern understanding of the demands of morality, and to move decisively beyond a conception of just war. So in this paper, I want to do three things. I want to open up a space for a position that is intermediate between just war theory and pacifism. So this position is more permissive than pacifism in that it would permit the legitimate protective violence in support of certain core rights, particularly when they're threatened by genocide and mass atrocity. But it's substantially less permissive than just war theory in that it would deny the justice of the social practice of war and repudiate the permission to fight war in defense of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's the first thing I want to do. Second thing I want to do is to develop a new, or I think somewhat new, form of moral criticism of war. Moral criticism of war has traditionally focused on its human and material costs, right? The destructiveness of war. And while this is certainly an important wrong-making feature of war, it is far from the only one. War can also be morally criticized as being contrary in certain particular ways, and I'm going to explain, to the demands of reason. I'll argue that the practice of war is not consistent with a minimally just political order required by what we might call the Enlightenment conception of the human person as being free, equal, and a rational agent. And the third thing I want to do is to argue that the most important aspects of the ethics of international violence concern what happens in the periods between and outside war itself. The critical task that should be at the center of an ethics of war concerns the development of morally appropriate procedural structures at national and international level to manage disputes that are currently resolved through war. So that's the agenda that I want to cover today. So I want to begin with what is perhaps the most famous single dictum in all of theorizing about war. And I'm first going to mangle it in German. Der Krieg ist eine bloße Fortsetzung der Politik mit anderen Mitteln. War is the continuation of politics with the addition of other means. So said the great Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz in Book 1, Chapter 1 of his great masterpiece on war. And this observation surely articulates a basic truth. War is fundamentally a form of violent politics. As Clausewitz goes on to say, war is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument. But modern moral theorists have, I believe, wholly failed to attend to the significance of Clausewitz's insight. If war is a form of politics, then we can investigate the morality of war by reflecting on the requirements of a minimally just political process. Now, Clausewitz was certainly no pacifist. In fact, he fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He spent his entire life as a loyal member of his regiment. But his observation contains the kernel of a powerful critique of war, and indirectly of just war theory itself. And it's this kind of idea that I want to develop. The essence of this critique can be stated very, very simply as follows. War, as Clausewitz observed, is fundamentally a form of politics, a form of violent politics. But a minimally just political process, I'm going to argue, is one that excludes violent coercion. Therefore, war is necessarily unjust. One of other presenters was hoping that I would structure my entire presentation in the form of a valid syllogism. So there's my first syllogism. Now, to develop this critique, we have to begin with a little bit more of a deeper understanding of what Clausewitz meant when he characterized war as a form of politics. This question is complicated by the fact that the German term Politik can be translated both as the English words politics, but also as the word policy. And Clausewitz sometimes ambiguates between these two senses. Indeed, some translators, such as Peter Parrott, use the two translations alternately in the text, depending on the particular context. But in the critical passages, it's clear that Clausewitz is using the term Politik to refer to a common sense understanding of politics as a process by which persons arrive at shared decisions and assert influence within and between groups. And that's the understanding of politics that I'm going to use. As he says, politics is the intercourse of governments and peoples. He goes on, we deliberately use the phrase with the continuation of other means, right? So war is politics with the addition of other means. We deliberately use this phrase because we want also to make clear that war itself does not suspend political intercourse or change it into something entirely different. In essentials, that intercourse continues, irrespective of the means that it employs. How could it be otherwise, he says? Do political relations between peoples and between their governments stop when diplomatic notes are no longer exchanged? Is war not just another expression of their thoughts, another form of speech or writing? Its grammar, indeed, may be its own, but not its logic. And close the quote. So war is politics in the sense that it is a means to settle matters of shared concern within and between groups. War is a procedure for deciding collective outcomes in situations of dissensus. In this respect, war performs a comparable function to other familiar mechanisms of social decision-making, including mechanisms of debate, majoritarian voting, committee decision-making, negotiation and mediation, and also we could think about judicial and quasi-judicial procedures. All of these processes can be described as political in the broader sense that I think that Clausewitz is using, because they are mechanisms or means for settling matters of mutual concern within and between groups, and for obtaining compliance with those decisions once made. As Clausewitz says, war performs a similar function to a written or spoken argument. The grammar may be different, but the logic, the function, is the same. Now, one really important observation that we have to make at this juncture is that acts of self-defense and of other defense are not political acts on this understanding of that term. What is self-defense? Self-defense is the interdiction of an imminent and grave violation of some person's rights. It is, as it were, the warding off of an imminent unjust blow or harm. But it's not in itself a form of political intercourse, in the sense of providing a process or a means or a mechanism for settling matters of mutual concern within and between groups. Now, why is that important? That's important because it's become foundational within contemporary just war theory to conceive of the ethics of war through the lens of self-defense. Indeed, for revisionist just war theory, such as Jeff McMahon at University of Rutgers, a just war just is a complex and coordinated succession of individual acts of self and other defense. Right? That's just what a just war is. Now, I think that it is indeed possible to have coordinated forms of collective violence that are, as the revisionist just war theorists say, simply particularly complex and coordinated acts of individual self-defense. I think that is possible. And I think that certain forms of military humanitarian intervention or of collective defense against genocide may indeed be examples of that. They may be, in other words, justified purely as a very complex set of individual acts of self-defense. But the important thing for this argument is that these forms of collectivized defensive violence, though they may look functionally like war, should not be conceived of war in the way that Clausewitz suggests we should use that term. Why? Because they lack the necessary political nature, right? They're simply a warding off of harm that doesn't have that broader political impact. So an act of self or other defense may have political consequences, but not in itself be an act of politics. In other words, it's not performed with the intent and purpose of settling matters of mutual concern within and between groups. So here's a kind of a little philosophy example just to motivate that intuition. So suppose that I go for tea at the White House with the president. And while we're sitting there having tea, the president suddenly and inexplicably flies into a violent rage and tries to kill me. And so I pick up a paperweight from the president's desk and I kill the president because it's the only way that I can preserve my life. Now, is that a political act? Well, it's certainly an act that has very profound political consequences for the United States of America. But it's not a political act, right? It's not something whose motivation and intent and meaning and context was given by a political process. It was simply an act of warding off an imminent harm. And that's what self-defense is. And I think it's a really, really important thing to understand because it drives a wedge between the way that we understand the violence of self-defense or other defense and the phenomenon of war, which, as Clausewitz rightly points out, is fundamentally and ineluctably political. So, war properly understood has an intrinsic political function. And this function is quite distinct from the function of self or other defense. The question from a moral perspective is, how should we think about war's essential political nature? And the intuition that I want to elicit and then explain and utilize is that there is a profound moral objection to the idea of war as a form of violent politics. In other words, to the conduct of politics through violence. So we can approach this objection by considering some examples of how violence affects or impacts the morality of common political procedures or processes. So imagine, for example, imagine an electoral process in which one group of voters was subject to violent attack and intimidation in order to impede their participation in the vote. Imagine a judicial procedure in which one party was able to kill or threaten with violence particular jurors in order to influence the verdict. Imagine a committee in which the chairman achieved a majority decision by using violence against particular committee members. In each of these examples, the presence of violence as an element, as a constitutive part of the decision-making or political process of collective decision, the use of violence in that context is sufficient to render that process profoundly unjust. Violence is obviously and decisively corrupting of the legitimacy of these processes. Note that this assessment is independent of the justice of the outcome. So it may well be that the guilty verdict delivered by the intimidated jury was objectively correct, right? The guy really did it. No matter. The process by which the decision was reached fails minimal standards of justice and renders the verdict unjust. Right? So we see this in many of these different circumstances. When violence plays a role in a decision procedure, it ineluctably corrupts that procedure from a moral perspective. So let me now give you a hypothesis of a principle that I believe underlies and explains the judgment that we have in these particular cases. And the principle is the following. Any tolerably just social order has to exclude violent coercion as a form of politics. That is to say, it must exclude violence as a constitutive part of the process by which collective decisions are made. What could be the ground of this principle? Where does it come from? Why do we have it? I want to suggest that it is rooted in the moral conception of human beings bequeathed to us by the Enlightenment. Human beings, on that view, have three fundamental moral attributes. They are free, that is to say, able to make independent decisions on their own volition. They are equal, possessing identical moral worth with one another. And they are rational, able to give and respond to reasons. A minimally just political process is one which recognizes and is consistent with this triad of moral characteristics. Now, it's tempting to think that violent politics is ruled out by this moral conception simply because it's coercive, right? Simply because it seeks to compel other individuals to act or behave in certain ways, irrespective of the person's will. Right? So you might think that just coercion itself is inconsistent with this Enlightenment conception of the moral subject. But that can't be right. If we consider, the most just form of politics consists in, because it's a kind of an idealized form of politics, would consist in collective decisions reached through a process of reasoned argumentation, persuading the other of a course of action on the basis of compelling reasons that he understands, accepts, and internalizes. Yet there's a sense in which reasoned argumentation is also coercive. Right? A valid argument compels us to accept a certain conclusion, whether we will that, whether we like that or not. Right? So argumentation is also coercive in a sense. So although there is a sense in which rational argumentation compels, and is therefore in a sense coercive, even though that's right, providing reasons is consistent with recognizing the rational agency of another. Indeed, we might say it's in a sense required by it. This is because reasons generate compliance, when they do so, by acting on and through the rational agency of the other. By providing reasons, we recognize the equal status of the other as a free and rational agent, inviting him to accept or contest the validity of our reasons on mutually shared grounds. Right? So when an argument persuades, it does so by engaging with, it does so through the will, the rational agency of the other. So what that tells us is that if there's a problem with violent politics, it doesn't lie simply in the fact that is an attempt to compel the will of the other. It lies in the particular way in which compellence is achieved. If rational argumentation is the paradigm of a just political decision procedure because it acts on and through the rational will of the other, physical violence is the antithesis of this. Right? It's the antithesis of a minimally just decision procedure because it entirely circumvents the other's rational agency. When I subject you to violence, I move or act upon your body as a pure physical object. Violence overrides your will through sheer physical force, ignoring and negating your status as a free and equal rational agent. So despite Clausewitz's superficial equivocation, we can think of rational argumentation and physical violence as standing at two extremes of the continuum of political practice. The former, rational argumentation, compels entirely through its action on the rational will of the other. The latter, physical violence, compels entirely by circumventing or overriding the rational will of the other. It compels, if you like, in spite of the other's rational agency. Between these two archetypes exists a spectrum of what we might call intermediate coercive practices. These are practices that compel persons not by completely circumventing the rational will of the other, as violence does, but by exploiting substantial constraints on the free agency of the other. So intermediate coercive practices work on and through the will of another, but only because either his cognitive agency or range of available options are compromised or radically constrained. So examples of this include blackmail, duress, or taking advantage of the distress of another for private gain. So my favorite example of the latter, actually, is the history of the fire service. Does anybody here know where the modern fire service originated from? It's a great story. So, the modern fire service started as a form of private enterprise. So there were enterprising people who privately bought firefighting equipment. And if your house was on fire, they would rock up and they would say, would you like to sell me your house? I'll give you $100,000 for it. And you'd say, are you out of your mind? It's worth $1 million. And they would say, well, if you don't like that price, we can wait 10 minutes and I'll offer you $10,000, right? It was a kind of parasitic exploitation depending on the fact that your optionality was so constrained by the circumstances. So this is a kind of what it describes an intermediate coercive practice because it's engaging with your will, with your agency, right? There's a sense in which you have the ability to say, no, I'm not going to sell you my house. But your optionality is so constrained by the circumstances that you have been effectively coerced in that way, in a very problematic way. So threats of physical violence, I think, are also a kind of intermediate coercive practice of this kind. But they lie, if we think about our continuum, they lie very, very close to actual physical violence in their moral status. The reason for this is that those who engage in threats of physical violence they're not only exploiting a very, very narrow constraint in your optionality, but they're responsible for that, right? So actually, you could think about the case where I not only exploit the fact that your house is on fire, but I actually lit your house on fire to start off with. And that's the distinction that you're drawing with. It is a form of minimally engaging with your rational will, but it's so close to physical compellence that I think it's reasonable to lump them together. And if you look, for example, at international legal regimes, the UN Charter prohibits equally the use and the threat of force. Right? So there's good reason for lumping the two of those together. So here then seems to me to be the fundamental source of the moral prohibition on violent politics. Forms of politics that involve violent coercion are not compatible with our moral status as free, equal, and rational beings. And that is because they circumvent, override, or deny our rational agency in these very, very problematic ways. They either act upon us as sheer objects, completely overriding and ignoring our existence as rational agents, or in the case of the threat of violence, they exploit radical constraints on our optionality and agency in a very morally problematic way. And as Clausewitz makes clear, war is fundamentally a form of violent coercion. Force, he says, that is physical force, is the means of war. To impose our will on the enemy is its object. So, taken together, this will give us what I want to call a position of Clausewitzian pacifism. Slightly mischievous term there, to associate Clausewitz's proud military name with a form of pacifism. But that form of Clausewitzian pacifism, I think, is probably the most defensible form that we can articulate. It's much preferable to certain kinds of more expansive understandings of pacifism which have historically been deployed, which viewed pacifism as an objection to violence to core. I don't think a pacifist needs to be committed to that. Or, for example, that included the prohibition on defensive force. I don't think pacifists need to agree to that either. It seems to me that the key to a plausible articulation of a pacifist or quasi-pacifist position is one that takes the Clausewitzian insight that war fundamentally is about conducting politics through violence and saying that there is something objectionable about that. So pacifism then, on this understanding, is an objection to war understood as a form of violent politics, but permitting defensive violence understood as the warding off of an imminent unjust blow, and perhaps even forms of collective and coordinated defensive violence, as we might find in a minimal and perhaps idealized form of military humanitarian intervention. Now, this argument is, I hope, at least prima facie plausible and attractive. But at this junction, we might find that familiar doubts start to intrude. So we might agree that war, in this understanding, is intrinsically morally problematic and unjustified, that it's an evil of a form. But is it not perhaps sometimes the lesser evil? We live in a dark and dangerous world of wicked men and corrupted states. Aggression, we know, is real and cannot be simply wished away by well-meaning theorists. When our society is faced with a military threat, then we have just two options, to fight or to surrender. How could it be right, as the pacifist position seems to imply, that we should simply give in to aggression? Not only would we be abandoning our own rights, but we would be encouraging predatory practices that endanger others also. In such a situation, we may fight with a heavy heart, with a full appreciation of the moral costs of our action, but perhaps we might conclude that fight we must. This is, one might feel, the remorseless moral logic of the real world. But those who press these concerns a mixture of realists, political realists, and traditional just war theorists, I believe in not only asking us the wrong questions, they're more importantly asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. The structure of traditional just war theory focuses our attention overwhelmingly on the moment of military crisis. Jus ad bellum addresses the justification of war in the context of an imminent or emerging military threat. Jus in bello addresses right conduct in the course of a conflict that is already ongoing. But if we view war in Clausewitzian terms as a mode of international politics, then we can see that some of the most important ethical issues concern what we do in the periods between military crises. The ultimate objective of international ethics is not to counsel either surrender or resistance to military aggression, but to develop morally justified and therefore non-violent ways to resolve disputes that are currently resolved through war. The object of international ethics, in other words, is not to regulate war, as just war theory and international law seek to do, but rather to supplant it, to find new and more morally acceptable modes of international politics. That's what I think we should really be focusing on. Now the pessimists, and again here I'm kind of referring to a broad coalition of political realists and just war theorists who align on this issue. The pessimists respond that this is just wishful thinking, this is just impossible. War is a permanent feature of human life, and it is therefore an unavoidable part of international politics, right? It's unavoidable, it's always going to be there, and so therefore we just have to deal with it. Since war cannot be eliminated, it must be regulated as effectively as possible to mitigate its evils. Immanuel Kant referred, not without a touch of self-irony, I think, to philosophers' sweet dreams of peace. To the pessimists, these dreams are dangerous and irresponsible fantasies. But the pessimists are wrong. War can be supplanted by alternative forms of political and institutional structure. We know that this is the case because it has happened. And as Aristotle reminds us, when we infer from something that is actual to something that is possible, that's always a valid inference. Right? We know that it's possible to eliminate war because we have, in fact, eliminated war. Within the modern world, there are, in fact, two highly significant spaces within which war has been effectively controlled and eventually eliminated. The first of these spaces is a geographical space. Over large sections of the globe, the United States, Australia, the European Union, Switzerland, federal or quasi-federal political structures have provided a framework for peaceful relations between states that have proved stable, enduring, and relatively just. The example of the European Union is particularly striking, both because of the breadth of the achievement, binding together under a law-governed institutional order 27 powerful states with histories of violent conflict, aggression, atrocity, and genocide stretching back many centuries. It is also interesting because of the innovative nature of the political structures employed. The European Union is not a traditional federal state, like the United States, Australia, or Switzerland. It's rather a quasi-federal structure in which elements of central control are combined with central elements of traditional state sovereignty. The second significant space in which war has been supplanted by alternative political structures is not a geographical, but a functional space. Throughout history, a major source of civil conflict has been revolutionary struggle between different contenders for state power. But modern states have learned to control and ultimately eliminate revolutionary war, not by regulating it, but by supplanting it with democratic process. Proponents of democracy proponents of democracy do not refer to themselves as pacifist revolutionaries. But in essence, that's what they are. When all is said and done, democracy is a way to carry out a revolution without having to take up arms. That's basically what democracy is. The strategy has been astonishingly successful. No advanced modern democracy has suffered a revolutionary war in the last century. Democracy and federalism are not, however, panaceas. While democracy has been highly effective at controlling revolutionary war, it's much less successful at controlling secessionist conflicts, of which there have been a number in modern democracies, including, of course, in this country with the American Civil War. And there's a very simple reason for this. In order to conduct a vote on a proposal to secede, you first have to know who is the relevant community to decide on that question. But that's precisely what's at issue. Right? So democracy is not so good at addressing the problem of secessionist violence, but it is very good at addressing the problem of revolutionary violence. But these examples, the example of federal communities of states and the control of revolutionary war through democracy, are very hopeful signs. They show, in fact, that war can be supplanted, not necessarily through the obvious routes of outlawing it and regulating it, or by surrendering the field to aggressors, but by finding compelling alternative structures to resolve the conflicts that are currently resolved through war. And again, I think that this is an implication of taking seriously Clausewitz's observation. If war is basically a mode of conducting international politics, then the objective has to be to think about more stable, peaceful, and just modes of doing what war was traditionally used to do. So what the pessimists really mean is not that it's impossible to exclude violent coercion from international politics. We know it's not impossible. We know that because we've done it. What they really mean is that it's bloody difficult. And that's true. It is difficult. But it's been true of every major moral advance in human history. Ending the slave trade was very difficult. Achieving the emancipation of women was very difficult. Gaining equal civil rights for citizens of all races. The achievement of democratic participation, of minimal welfare provision for the most vulnerable members of society. All of these struggles were extraordinarily difficult, but they were possible. There is no reason to believe that the ending of violent coercion as a dominant mode of international politics cannot similarly be achieved. And anyone who's read Steven Pinker's book or looked at the large-scale empirical research studies that have been done on international and civil wars will realize that the trend lines are all in this direction. When the prize is so great, the effort must surely be commensurate. But achieving this will require a revolution in the way that we have traditionally approached the ethics of war. First, I believe it will require us to abandon just war theory's commitment to the possibility of a justified war. All war on this account, I believe, should be regarded as unjust. At least all war understood in the Clausewitzian sense of a form of violent politics. All war understood in that sense is just. And just war theory is wrong to suggest otherwise. Second, the most important aspects of an ethics of war concerns, as I suggested, not simply or not even primarily the moments of military crisis, right? What we do when a crisis emerges, but it concerns the things that we do in the spaces between conflict. It concerns issues such as the way that we structure our force posture, the way that we equip and train our armies, our alliance mechanisms, all of these things that tend to be, as it were, pushed away and excluded from attention by just war theory's obsessive focus on the moment of crisis. So if international politics are to be made minimally just, then violent coercion has to be excluded, as I said, as a form of politics, as a form of international decision procedure. Just as in domestic society, collective violent action will always be required to address threats of significant rights violations from states and from non-state actors. But as in domestic society, this violent coercion... that addresses a part of the talk that I didn't discuss. Let me leave that. So in domestic society, the procedures that we have deployed to address these political problems have centered on majoritarian voting and on judicial process. And when we look at the international sphere, we may find that elements of this are applicable there too. But we shouldn't assume that the forms of just procedure that we use there at the international domain will be the same or even commensurate. Modified, composite, and innovative new forms of international political structure may be required. And indeed, we've found this to be the case with the experience of the development of the European Union over the last 60 years. There can be no doubt that just war theory has played a role of immense value in consistently and over long stretches of human history asserting the necessary role of moral oversight of war and in developing our conceptual tools for doing this. But just war theory remains committed to the potential permissibility of war, and of war conceived in all of its Clausewitzian splendor. Such a commitment, I believe, is not compatible with the Enlightenment view of human beings that is central to modern moral and political thought. Just war theory, that was for a long time part of the solution, has now, I think, become part of the problem. And for that reason, I think that it's time to consider the forms of moral, political, and also legal structure that will come after just war theory. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions, so please feel free to use your questions. Yes,
thank you very much, Professor Roden. You have raised extremely difficult concepts in what I would like to think a quite innovative and radical approach to just war as fundamentally immoral. I have three little remarks that might help. They also perhaps denote my lack of full understanding of the argument, or a suggestion to see whether that there's other sources that you obviously didn't have time to look into might actually help you. You start with Clausewitz and with your lecture on a very different understanding of Clausewitz, turned positively by admitting that politics is in the heart of it. Now, my recollection of the passages is intriguing because I remember it. I think that Fortsetzung der Politik mit anderen Mitteln, so the pursuit of politics with other means, obviously appears in chapter 1 of the Krieg, von Krieg. But there's also an intriguing variation on this, where instead of Fortsetzung der Politik, it's Fortsetzung der Staatspolitik. And in that sense, the very strong Hegelian dimension of Clausewitz suggests, if I may, that the order of comparison that you put forward between individual reaction to violence or perpetration of violence is the same as a collective one. I think there is a fundamental discrepancy that comes with this variation on Politik and Staatspolitik that it might be worth probing a bit further. I think you allude to it at the end. I think it starts from very early on, where you're considering the monopoly of violence to be part of the state, and Clausewitz operating under this paradigm. The other source which your wonderful lecture triggers is, and in relation to enlightenment, it seems to me that your argument does not build, and I'm very referential, does not build much on what Kant achieved in his treaty on perpetual peace. So Kant says, of course, as you know, that republics don't go to war against each other, and that if you want to have peace eternal on earth, then you just need to have the states that compose the world system to be all democratic. It doesn't seem to me that you're saying something different. In fact, I think it's a little bit of a retreat over Kant, in that if that is the condition of eternal peace for the democratic peace theory, then what we need to work on politically is to ensure that the domestic situation of all states is one of the republic understood as democracy. And in that sense, the agenda is quite different. It is no longer an issue of international relations per se. It's an issue of making sure that countries are ordered in such a way that the political system is not violent. Now, a bit of a downturner, if you will, from a lawyer's perspective. What has always struck me, though, when we come to defining the state and the politics, is that I don't think it's that easy to dismiss the role of violence in the state, not only on the basis of Weber's monopoly, but also on the works of Cover, where he reminds us, particularly us jurists, that judges deal pain and death every day. That is, without that very severe threat of violence, there is no law that would work.
Yeah.
And connectedly, our colleague Jane Mansbridge in Harvard has recently worked a very interesting development on this coercion in society. When you think of it, law is very coercive. And law is defined by a majority usually. And that to that extent, the idea that there is no violence within the political order starts from a premise that is not sustained.
Yeah. Good. So let me address the last of the concerns first. Pardon me. So I actually have a whole section in this paper, which I omitted to read for questions of time, but which is precisely on the Weber and that issue. So, so obviously you're right. It's, as Weber pointed out, it's almost impossible to conceive of a political order, just or unjust, without recourse to certain kinds of coercive violence, and law is the paradigm example of that. So how do you make sense of that in the context of this argument, which, as you rightly point out, is entirely Kantian in spirit? So I certainly want to accept that. So I think what you have to say about that is that there is a very profound distinction between violence as a mode of politics, by which I mean violence as a constitutive part of the process by which decisions are made within and between groups. So violence that plays a role in how matters are settled, in its broader sense, within a group. On the one hand, and on the other hand, violence which is the outcome of some kind of prior, just and appropriate decision procedure. So the way that I describe it is a distinction between violence as an input to a process and violence as an output of a process. Now, obviously, if you have a procedure that is legitimate and just in the sense that it takes into account the rights and moral status of those involved in the way that law does, and in the way that just political processes do, then violence can absolutely morally appropriately be the output of that. And that violence may indeed be entirely legitimate. What I'm saying is that we cannot have a conception of a just procedure that involves violence as an input. So, to take one example, to take the example of the court that makes a decision on the basis of law, using appropriate evidence and taking into account the procedural rights of all parties, can order violence to be used against that party. It can imprison them or use other coercive measures. But what is utterly corrupting of the legitimacy of that is if violence were an input into the judicial procedure itself. So that's in the examples that I gave, if the prosecutor were able to intimidate the jurors. Input violence is always inevitably corrupting. Output violence, not necessarily. And that's a really, really fundamental distinction. So on the Kantian point, I just want to acknowledge, yes, you're right. On the interpretation points, I think these things will always be contestable and difficult. And I think what's difficult about Clausewitz is we know that he was planning to rewrite the whole text. The only thing that he did manage to rewrite was book one. And to me, the interpretative question is less interesting than the question of where do we get to if we take seriously the contention, which I do believe was at least part of what Clausewitz was saying. Whether it was his fully considered and final view, I don't know. But at least part of what he was saying is something that strikes me as fundamentally correct, that war itself is a mode of politics between states, and that provides us an extremely important starting point for moral thinking on war.
we should go in the back. Cindy?
Thank you. Yeah, that was interesting. I just have a question. I'd like to hear you elaborate a little bit more because I'm having trouble seeing the exact structure of your argument. So it seems clear that you conceptualize war as a kind of series of self-defensive actions. It's easier to justify it. Whereas if you think of it in terms of politics, as you point out, there are strong reasons to oppose it. It doesn't engage people's reason. It doesn't treat them as free and equal rational being. But my worry about that, so my worry is that it seems to me you have to have some independent criteria for deciding what things count as politics or not. Because it seems like really the obvious response to this would be something like, well, war isn't a form of politics. Because I think this is in fact sort of embedded in the social contract tradition. So in the Enlightenment view that you're appealing to, the idea is that politics is when you adjudicate conflicts by engaging people's reason. Right? That's what politics is. And that's what structures, for example, the distinction between, say, the state of nature, where we don't use politics, where we have war and violence, and then the emergence of civil society in which we use politics to adjudicate our conflicts. And so unless you have some independent argument, then there's no reason to even agree with your starting point.
Yeah, good. No, so this is clearly a problematic component of the argument. So I think that the way that I would want to address that is by starting with an understanding of what self-defense is, right? So the starting point would be to say we can give an account of how defensive violence taken against an imminent threat can be justifiable. And one of the things that's happened within philosophy in the last decade or so is that we have now a very, very sophisticated and well-developed understanding of how that can be, how it's consistent with our understanding of human rights, concepts like forfeiture and so forth. So we have that understanding. And so then the question is, so starting with that kind of conception of self-defense, how far up the food chain towards what we traditionally consider to be war can we move? And my response to that is not very far at all, right? We can perhaps justify certain kinds of very, very minimal military humanitarian intervention, where you're literally just focusing on interdicting imminent threats of genocide, crimes against humanity, and so forth. We can probably do the same in terms of a defensive war against a genocidal aggressor, but certainly we can't go to anything like the traditional just war account of a right to fight a war of self-defense against an aggressor who is simply threatening our territorial integrity and political sovereignty, which is the classic definition within international law, for example. We can't get anywhere close to that. So that's why I describe the position as kind of intermediate between classical pacifism and just war theory. So we end up by saying, yeah, certain kinds of things that traditionally look like war we can understand on the basis of a minimal right of self-defense, but nothing like what just war theory and traditional LOAC gives us. And so in a sense, my argument is saying, well, this is just a sensible way of describing that, right? Of saying that when we talk about whether war is justified, a more helpful way of understanding what war is the way that Clausewitz gives us, which is to say, war is not a kind of form of individual self-defense. It's a kind of politics. It's like giving, it's like written or verbal speech, right? Giving an argument, but as Clausewitz says, just with a different grammar. It's basically doing the same thing. It's trying to provide a solution to these collective decision procedures through a kind of violence. Now that's a different usage to the kind of social contract usage that you were making. What I find helpful about this usage is that it enables us to give, I think, a much clearer and more plausible account of what pacifism can be taken to be articulating, right? So it's not saying we need to object to violence or to self-defense. It's saying that there's something specifically wrong with war, and it's providing us, I think, a very useful and comprehensible context for understanding what that problem can be and articulating it.
Before we go back over there, and here too, perhaps we should hear from a militant pacifist who is Cheney right there, addressing to your questions to our contingent pacifist who is there.
This won't be as interesting or provocative as Dean suggested it might be. I actually agree, though, with one of the previous people that the position that you're sketching, David, really is quite close to Kant. So I think it fills it out better, because Kant is obviously very unhappy with just war theory, but other than saying that war kind of conflicts with the demands of right, he never really says that.
That's right, yeah.
But also Kant allows for violent self-defense. Actually, historically, many pacifists allowed for violent self-defense on the grounds that you're suggesting, which is that they didn't regard that as war. They regarded it as something different. The U.S. Constitution also doesn't regard it as war, because the president has the right to engage in acts of self-defense, but doesn't have the right to declare war. So that's actually a distinction that is very, very old one. Let me go raise an issue about the Clausewitz interpretation, because this probably would be why pacifists might go further than what you're saying. I think that Clausewitz, the element which is not present in your discussion, is the theme in Clausewitz that war by its very nature is something that we lose control of. And remember, Clausewitz was writing at the same time as Marx, and in some sense it's the same theme you find in Marx, that we create market relations for all these great purposes, and then we've created this monster that by its very nature cancels any kind of human purpose or will. And John Keegan puts that very nicely, as saying that what Clausewitz identifies is that if the purpose of war is to achieve political ends, the nature of war is to cancel any political ends and just become an end in itself. So now, in a practical way, this would translate into, there's obviously a lot of truth to that. So in terms of what you're sketching about how we sort of just orient ourselves towards peacemaking, is this maybe just, is this then the theme of sort of more vigilance towards military arrangements about they not achieve the autonomy and stuff like that? I mean, it sounds like where you would want to go with that. Maybe you could say.
Yeah, so I think that would be one of the implications. I mean, I think there are elements in Clausewitz that I think are sympathetic to that line of argument as well. So, you know, Clausewitz famously says that there is a kind of theoretical tendency in conflict always to go towards extreme and total war. And he says, you know, in reality, it's kind of restrained and modified by these kinds of contingent, accidental incidents. But that kind of tendency to escalate and to spiral out of control, it was something that he was very interested in as well. So in terms of the kind of practical consequences that you should draw from it, I think one is the one that you mentioned, that we have to be vigilant to the series of things that we do in the periods between war, is certainly one of them. I think the other is just to really press and to reiterate how limited and minimal the defensive right really is, right? So I mean, the rights of self and other defense, when you actually give a proper account of it, turns out to be incredibly narrow, right? It's literally the right to interdict or to ward off an imminent, unjust attack or threat to very significant rights, where the defensive action is proportionate, it doesn't inflict greater harm than it would prevent, where it's necessary, and so forth. Now, that's really a very, very minimal set of capabilities. I think that what just war theory has tended to do is it's helped itself to the self-defense argument, but that it has structured this in terms of a kind of Clausewitzian political conception of war. It said, well, because we can obviously fight wars of self-defense, we all agree to that, therefore we are justified in engaging in and developing the full mechanisms of a political structure for conducting politics through force. And so, so you have executives that make use of the idea of, a necessary military action as self-defense at the moment of crisis. But then you have military planning documents. In the US, you have this quadrennial defense report, which is in which our military policy and strategy is discussed entirely in kind of realpolitik terms. The funding and the resourcing of the military as a means to maintain American power and influence in a way that is completely disconnected from that self-defense. So I think one of the things that you get from an argument like this is to be able to separate those two different components, to say, yeah, we can give an account of a very, very minimal form of defensive force, but that's completely inconsistent with the way that we resource, plan, structure, strategize our military in all these other contexts. And so we need to rethink that.
We'll go back one to Tariq and then come forward to Dee and then go to Pratik. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I also want to build a little bit on what was said here. One, of course, I'm very happy that you retracted a little bit on Kant, which I thought was relevant. But let me say something along the lines of the comment that you made this morning. But stepping back a little bit. One is that, I mean, in the later part of Clausewitz, chapter 28, I believe, where he talks about this miraculous trinity, about reason, passion, and circumstance determining war, and reason being statecraft. That's linked to his observation that the warmongers always lose. I think as how it was expressed, that whatever you are pursuing, you will lose through the act of war, and essentially that you never win. That's kind of the implication. And once you say you never win, you always bring it back that statecraft can never tell you to let's say inflict a war. Now, and in some sense, that is that contingent opposition or contingent pacifism, as Dean mentioned. But two additional thoughts come to mind. One is, and I say that a little bit hesitantly because of problems that people have with this author, but Niall Ferguson's book, The War of the Worlds, my reading of that book is that he says, we agreed on borders, so we reduced the wars between the countries, but then they went inside, and you got the pogroms and the conflicts and the violence and the civil war within the countries. So in some sense, the moment you agree on one set of borders, you have to create another set. And that seems to be continuing even now, as we speak, perhaps not in the countries that were savages, but in the other countries. The other thought that, and in some sense that actually tells us a little bit about the limited meaning of the word war, because if the same violence is now transferred to another domain, obviously what it means is just being displaced rather than being engaged. But the second problem is that obviously, von Clausewitz was writing at a time when the promise of the Industrial Revolution was just beginning. For 100 years, we actually looked at a dark future, and only later on, as Stephen Pinker reminds us, that we began to interpret some of the better parts of it. But as we had an opportunity to discuss this morning, it may be that was because we now had entered this positive sum game, and Clausewitz's idea that wars never win was actually contingent upon. And so if you have a zero-sum game, maybe wars can win. But once you have a positive sum game, there's no point in waging war. But if that age has ended, are we going back into a process in which there will be a justification for just war? Is it that it is contingent only on the last 2 centuries and we wasted 150 years of that, but maybe it is relevant for the next 150 years? Is that, how do you see the impacts of the limits and perhaps the emergence of the zero-sum world on the ideas?
Yeah. Good. So, look, I think that there are a lot of different reasons that you can have to object to warfare. So one of them, obviously, is that it's very often self-defeating, and that's clearly true. You see that anyone who's just read anything in the history of warfare realizes that very often the decision to recourse to war was disastrous for those that took that step. And that's often, that's a very good reason often not to go to war. But for those who take morality seriously, even if that's true, or even in the cases where that's not true, we can still think about independent reasons that are genuinely moral. So, the burden of the argument today was to say, irrespective of whether it's within your own long-term self-interest to engage in these activities, there is something intrinsic to the activity itself. There's something intrinsically about the idea of politics conducted through violence which is morally problematic. So I think that those two ideas are they are separate. But it's important that there is a degree of congruence between them. So if morality was telling you to do something that was constantly and consistently in tension with what's obviously within your own long-term best interest, it's going to be very difficult for morality to make any headway. So what we try to do with legal institutions, for example, is we try to harmonize those, right? We try to create mechanisms which will bring together the long-term individual and social self-interest of groups and persons with their genuine kind of obligations. Now, is there any reason to think that project is not going to be possible in the long term? I don't think that there is. I mean, I think that, the Europe... So, you said, well, if we have structures... So, one of the objections is often made against the idea of a global state, for example, is people say, well, if you have a global state, sure, by definition, there wouldn't be any international laws because there'd be only one state. But what you would just do is you would recategorize what are now international laws, they would just become civil wars, but you wouldn't necessarily eliminate. If that's all that's happening, then there's clearly no progress. But the European Union gives us, again, good reason to think that that doesn't always happen. So, it's not that we've just traded international wars on the European continent for civil wars. We've actually made the whole continent more peaceful. And so I think that there are good grounds for optimism. I think, the big question we were discussing this morning about whether that's really contingent on having a kind of constantly expanding pie for all, I don't know. I think, again, I think we kind of need to wait and find out whether that's the case or not.
I have seen quite a few hands, so we'll take them right now, the questions only, and then you'll have the last word, maybe
Sure.
a matter of 7 or 8 minutes max. So keep your questions very short. Do you want to ask a question? Then we'll go there.
Where would you rank the use of sanctions in your pacifism violence?
Very good, yeah.
Very good. That's one question. How about you, Francis?
Yes, in your answer to one of the questions, you said war could be an outcome from just procedures. I was a little bit concerned with where it might take you. Is the Security Council a just procedure?
Yeah.
I mean, how would you think about that?
Yeah, okay, good.
And then Pratik, over there.
Thank you for your remark, Professor. I was just wondering if the age in which we live requires a reinterpretation of Clausewitz's definition of war, mainly in terms of war as a violent form of economics. I couldn't help but notice, but the paradigm within which you work to come up with this paper, as well as the zones you describe, are Western in nature and origin. While the Enlightenment conception of the South might have aided these parts of the world, that conception has arguably disadvantaged other parts of the world. I'm just wondering if in supplanting political violence, the Enlightenment-inspired movement that you described has resorted to a form of economic oppression, a slower form of violence, but an extremely damaging one nonetheless.
Gage?
In an attempt to synthesize a lot of what's been said, probably not nearly as insightful as them, is your assertion that in this politics, war is politics, that in the global, whether it's the United Nations or the international community, is a parliamentary order and war is just suspension of Robert's Rules of Order, just so that when after the war and the rules are reinstated, there's no longer an opposition. Is that, in a sense, what the assertion is, whether it's economic war or political or violence?
Okay, with these questions, then we'll let David speak and have the last word.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood the last question, but let me try and kind of take them in reverse order. So, The understanding of violence that I'm operating with is a very classical and minimal one. So I am thinking specifically about physical violence, and I don't tend to be very sympathetic to more expansive definitions of violence that include structural inequalities or other forms of injustice. Not that I think that those are not important, but I think that it's a mistake to analyze them in the same terms as violence. Has the Enlightenment kind of just supplanted, has it been good for the West while subjecting everybody else to kind of very oppressive and unjust forms of economic deprivation? I think there's no doubt that there is a lot that's very unjust about the global world order. There's no question about that. I tend to be more optimistic, though, about the long-term prospects of the kind of liberal economic conception. I think that in many ways there is a lot to be said. So I talked a lot at the end about finding other kinds of mechanism that supplant the kind of things that we traditionally have done through violent conflict. And I actually think that market relations is one of those mechanisms that's been very, very successful. When people realize that it can actually be much better for everybody when you compete with your neighbors economically through trying to increase productivity and drive down costs, rather than by sending your soldiers across the border, that's a really, really good thing. That's not to say that that doesn't have very significant negative externalities. There could be environmental costs. It could be that by, increasing your own competitiveness, you decrease the ability of other states to provide basic needs. Those externalities are definitely there, but net, I think that structure is a big advantage, and it's definitely an improvement on the kinds of violent conflicts that we had beforehand. So I tend to be more optimistic about that. Can war be an outcome of a just procedure? So what I said was not that war could be an outcome of a just procedure. I said that violence could be an outcome of a just procedure. And the distinction is because on the way that I'm using war, that's almost incorrect by definition, because war, on the way that I'm using it, is just a kind of political decision procedure. It is a way of working things out. And in that sense, it's not something that we conceive as being analogous to a court making an order which includes the ability to use violence to carry that out. War, in that sense, is much more like using violence to arrive at the court's order, and that, I think, is intrinsically problematic. And the final one was sanctions. Sanctions, I think, are very, very difficult. So there's one way of thinking about sanctions, which is to say that they are, in fact, just a kind of warfare. They're a kind of siege warfare, and a particularly problematic kind because they are more often than not aimed directly at civilians. In recent years, we've gotten a lot better at how we think about sanctions. I mean, if you look, for example, at the sanctions during the 90s against Iraq, and they were morally catastrophic. I mean, absolutely catastrophic. They probably inflicted more harm on non-combatants than the 2003 Iraq War. And that, is clearly, that's very, very close to, if not, morally on a par with the kinds of, hot violence of war that's more obvious. But then if you think about more targeted kinds of sanctions, so for example, sanctions that are targeted specifically at the financial assets of high-ranking persons who are directly responsible for, let's say, genocide or atrocity or other human rights abuses, then I think that is, and those sanctions were themselves the outcome of some kind of legitimate law-governed process that we can understand as having being fair and having being done with good evidential standards and with certain kinds of due process rights, then that looks much more like acceptable outcome violence and not war, as they're saying. I mean, I think all of these are kind of aspects of the problem that someone mentioned earlier about how we draw the distinction between war and these other forms of legitimated violence. And the difficulty is that it's very hard to give a big overarching theoretical account that will just knock it down. I think probably what you need to do is kind of look in a much more granular way, case by case, at sanctions, at different kinds of sanctions, and see how they fall on the basis of the different criteria that characterize those two different kinds of modes.
Thank you. With that, we should give our thanks to Dr. David.